The transformation of Adolf Hitler from terrifying dictator to Halloween costume represents one of the most striking examples of how death and defeat can strip power from figures who once commanded absolute authority and inspired genuine terror. During his lifetime, Hitler was untouchable in Germany. His image was sacred, protected by laws that made mockery or disrespect punishable by imprisonment or death. The cult of personality surrounding the Führer meant that any hint of irreverence could result in visits from the Gestapo, interrogations, and potentially far worse consequences. Germans were required to greet each other with Heil Hitler, to display his portrait in their homes and businesses, to treat him as a messianic figure who had rescued Germany from humiliation and would lead the nation to glory. The idea of dressing up as Hitler for entertainment, of turning him into a figure of fun, would have been literally unthinkable during the Third Reich. But death changes everything, especially when it comes accompanied by total defeat and the revelation of unimaginable crimes. When Hitler committed suicide in his bunker on April 30, 1945, as Soviet forces closed in on Berlin, he left behind a Germany in ruins and a legacy of genocide and destruction. The 1,000-year Reich he had promised lasted 12 years and ended with German cities in rubble, millions dead, the nation divided and occupied by foreign powers, and the horrifying evidence of the Holocaust being discovered in concentration camps across Europe. The German people, who had followed Hitler with varying degrees of enthusiasm, now had to confront what their leader and their nation had done. The immediate post-war period in Germany was characterized by what historians have called a collective silence about the Nazi era. Most Germans claimed they had never really supported Hitler, that they had been deceived or forced, that they hadn't known about the concentration camps or the genocide. This convenient amnesia allowed people to avoid confronting their own complicity, but it also meant that serious discussion of the Nazi period was often avoided. Hitler's name was mentioned rarely and then, usually only in the most serious contexts. Discussions of guilt and responsibility and the need to ensure nothing like the Third Reich could ever happen again. But human psychology is complicated, and one way people deal with trauma and shame is through humor, even dark and inappropriate humor. By the 1950s and 1960s, particularly in West Germany as it rebuilt and integrated into Western democratic society, attitudes toward the Nazi past began to shift. The generation that had lived through the war was aging, and younger Germans who had been children during the Third Reich or born after the war were asking uncomfortable questions about what their parents and grandparents had done. This generational tension created space for different kinds of engagement with the Nazi past, including uses of satire and mockery that would have been impossible immediately after the war. Halloween, as celebrated in America, was not a traditional German holiday. The German calendar included Carnival or Fatching, pre-Lenten celebrations featuring costumes and parties, but the American-style Halloween, with its focus on October 31st, trick-or-treating, and horror-themed costumes, was a foreign import. As American cultural influence spread throughout West Germany during the decades after World War II, some Germans, particularly younger people interested in American culture, began adopting Halloween celebrations. These were typically small affairs, costume parties among friends, rather than the community-wide celebrations common in America, but they represented an opening for cultural experimentation and boundary testing. It was in this context that Hitler costumes began appearing at Halloween and costume parties in Germany, though this development occurred gradually and remained controversial. The earliest instances seem to have emerged in the 1960s and 1970s, often among younger Germans who saw dressing as Hitler as a form of transgressive humor, a way to rob the Führer of his remaining power by reducing him to the level of a costume, a caricature, a joke. The Hitler costume was deliberately offensive, which was partly the point. It was a way of saying that this man, who had once been untouchable and sacred, could now be mocked and ridiculed without consequence. The typical Hitler costume consisted of elements that made the dictator immediately recognizable. The small toothbrush mustache, the side-parted dark hair combed across the forehead, the brown uniform shirt, the swastika armband, perhaps an iron cross or other military decoration, sometimes a military cap. More elaborate costumes might include jodhpurs and riding boots, the style Hitler favored. The costume wearer might attempt to mimic Hitler's speaking style, his gestures, his mannerisms, all of which had been seared into the German collective memory through years of newsreels and propaganda films. The performance was usually exaggerated and comic, turning Hitler's theatrical speaking style and dramatic gestures into objects of ridicule. The motivations for wearing Hitler costumes were complex and varied. Some wearers genuinely intended mockery and disrespect, seeing the costume as a way to demystify and diminish a figure who had caused so much suffering. For these people, making Hitler into a Halloween costume was a form of cultural revenge, taking back power from someone who had wielded it so destructively. If Hitler could be reduced to a costume that people wore to parties, if he could become a source of laughter rather than fear, then his ghost was finally being exorcised from German society. But other motivations were darker and more troubling. Some people wore Hitler costumes as a form of nostalgia, particularly older Germans who had supported the Nazis and who used the costume as a way to express continued admiration while maintaining plausible deniability. They could claim to be joking, to be participating in a costume party, while actually sending signals to like-minded individuals about their ongoing loyalty to Nazi ideas. The costume became a way to express forbidden thoughts and allegiances in a context where open support for Nazism was illegal and socially unacceptable. Still others wore Hitler costumes out of a kind of nihilistic provocation, wanting to shock and disturb, to cross boundaries and violate taboos. For these people, the point wasn't political at all, or at least not in any conventional sense. The point was to cause offense, to demonstrate their willingness to do things that society considered unacceptable, to position themselves as rebels against social norms. That dressing as Hitler was offensive to Holocaust survivors, to Allied veterans, to anyone with basic moral sensibility, was the appeal rather than a drawback. The reaction to Hitler costumes in Germany was and remains intensely divided. Many Germans, particularly those old enough to remember the war, or who had lost family members to Nazi persecution or the war, found Hitler costumes deeply offensive and disturbing. For Holocaust survivors living in Germany, seeing someone dressed as the man who had ordered the murder of their families was traumatizing beyond words. Jewish organizations consistently condemned Hitler costumes and called for them to be banned. Veterans who had fought against Hitler and survivors of concentration camps spoke out about how these costumes trivialized the suffering that had been inflicted and made a joke of history's most devastating genocide. German law complicated the situation. After World War II, Germany implemented strict laws against Nazi symbols and ideology. Displaying the swastika, giving the Nazi salute, and expressing support for Nazi ideology became criminal offenses. These laws were designed to prevent any resurgence of Nazism and to demonstrate Germany's complete rejection of its Nazi past. However, these laws included exceptions for educational, artistic, and historical purposes. A history teacher could show Nazi symbols in class. A film about the Third Reich could feature swastikas. The question was whether a Halloween costume constituted art or education, or whether it was simply a legal display of Nazi symbols. Courts in Germany have generally taken the position that context matters. A Hitler costume worn as obvious mockery or satire might be protected as artistic expression, while the same costume worn in a way that suggests admiration or support for Nazi ideology would be illegal. But making these distinctions in practice is extremely difficult. How do you determine the wearer's intent? How do you distinguish between mockery and nostalgia when the costume itself is identical? These questions have led to inconsistent enforcement and ongoing controversy. The international dimension of Hitler costumes added another layer of complexity. As Halloween became more globally celebrated, Hitler costumes began appearing in countries around the world, worn by people who had no personal connection to Germany or the Holocaust. and who often seemed unaware of or indifferent to the offense they were causing. In America, Britain, and other countries, people would occasionally wear Hitler costumes to Halloween parties, sometimes as deliberate shock value, sometimes with minimal thought about the implications. Each time photos of these costumes appeared on social media, they would generate waves of outrage and debate about what was appropriate for costume wear. The irony that Hitler himself would have found Halloween costumes ridiculous makes the eventual transformation of Hitler into a Halloween costume particularly striking. Hitler's worldview emphasized German cultural superiority and martial spirit. He viewed American culture with contempt, seeing it as mongrelized and degenerate. Halloween, with its roots in folk traditions and its modern manifestation as a children's holiday featuring candy and costumes, would have struck Hitler as exactly the kind of frivolous nonsense that demonstrated American cultural inferiority. The idea that Germans, his own people, would one day dress up as him for Halloween parties would have been incomprehensible and enraging to Hitler. The man who demanded absolute reverence reduced to a costume worn for laughs at parties would have been the ultimate humiliation. This transformation reflects a broader pattern in how societies deal with dictators and totalitarian leaders after their fall. During their time in power, these figures surround themselves with carefully constructed images of strength, authority, and inevitability. They control how they are portrayed, eliminating any hint of weakness or ridicule. But once they lose power, especially through dramatic defeat or death, these carefully constructed images collapse. The person who is untouchable becomes a subject of mockery. The symbols that inspired fear become objects of derision. Statues are torn down, portraits are defaced, and eventually the fallen dictator becomes a cultural reference point for evil or incompetence, stripped of any remaining dignity. Charlie Chaplin's The Great Dictator, released in 1940 before America entered World War II, represented an early attempt to use comedy to undermine Hitler. Chaplin's character, clearly modeled on Hitler, was buffoonish and ridiculous, engaged in slapstick comedy that made the dictator seem laughable rather than terrifying. The film was banned in Germany and occupied territories as Nazi authorities understood that mockery was dangerous to their carefully maintained image of power and authority. They were right to be concerned. Humor and ridicule are powerful weapons against authoritarianism, because they expose the gap between the grandiose self-image that dictators project and the often banal or even pathetic reality underneath. The evolution of Hitler from untouchable Führer to Halloween costume represents the ultimate triumph of this kind of mockery. The man who once commanded armies, who sent millions to their deaths, who redrew the map of Europe, has been reduced to a set of costume elements that anyone can buy from a party store. The toothbrush mustache, the hairstyle, the uniform, all the visual elements of Hitler's carefully constructed image are now available for purchase and can be worn by anyone who wants to make a statement, tell a joke, or cause offense. Hitler has become, in the most literal sense, a caricature. But this transformation raises uncomfortable questions about memory and responsibility. Does turning Hitler into a costume trivialize the Holocaust? Does it make light of suffering that should never be forgotten or minimized? Does the distance of time and the fading of living memory make mockery more acceptable? Or does it make proper remembrance even more important? These questions don't have easy answers, and different people reach different conclusions based on their values and their relationship to this history. Holocaust educators and memorial organizations have consistently argued that Hitler costumes, regardless of intent, are inappropriate and harmful. They trivialize the Holocaust, they cause pain to survivors and descendants of victims, and they contribute to a cultural environment where the Nazi genocide is increasingly treated as just another historical event, rather than as a unique moral catastrophe that demands ongoing vigilance and remembrance. From this perspective, the fact that Hitler has become a Halloween costume represents not a victory over his legacy, but a failure of memory and moral seriousness. Others argue that mockery and ridicule are appropriate responses to Hitler, and that allowing him to retain any sense of dignity or gravitas, even in death, gives him more respect than he deserves. From this view, turning Hitler into an object of laughter and derision is entirely appropriate. He should be mocked, reduced to a costume, stripped of any remaining power to inspire fear or awe. The problem with this argument is that mockery requires context and care. Sophisticated satire that clearly condemns what Hitler represented serves a different function than a thoughtless costume worn to a party by someone who hasn't seriously considered the implications. The generational aspect of Hitler costumes is particularly significant. For people who lived through World War II, or who lost family members to the Holocaust or the war, Hitler is not a distant historical figure but a living memory, someone whose actions directly affected their lives. For them, seeing Hitler costumes is deeply personal and painful. But for younger generations, particularly those born decades after the war, Hitler is increasingly just a figure from history books, no more real than Napoleon or Julius Caesar. This distance makes mockery easier because the emotional weight is lighter, but it also raises concerns about whether the lessons of the Holocaust are being forgotten as living memory fades. The phenomenon of Hitler costumes also reveals something about how Halloween functions as a cultural space where normal boundaries can be temporarily transgressed. Halloween allows people to dress as monsters, criminals, historical villains, and other figures that would be inappropriate in everyday contexts. This license to transgress is part of Halloween's appeal, but it also creates opportunities for expressions that cross from transgression into genuine offense. The question is where the line should be drawn, and who gets to decide. The irony of Germans dressing as Hitler for Halloween parties, something the dictator would have found contemptible on multiple levels, represents both a kind of cultural revenge and a troubling symptom of fading memory. Hitler, who took himself so seriously and demanded that others do the same, has been reduced to a costume, a joke, a theatrical performance at parties. The transformation is complete. The man who once commanded absolute authority in Germany is now an outfit that Germans and others wear for amusement. Whether this represents healthy demystification or dangerous trivialization remains a subject of legitimate debate, but the transformation itself is undeniable. The Führer has become a Halloween costume, and there is no clearer indication of how thoroughly death and defeat can strip power from even the most terrifying figures.